There are two stats that we don't often correlate, one in particular. So one is that for the last 7 years, Black women have been the leading demographic starting businesses. And we say, okay, that's great over there. How does that connect to corporate? Well, it connects to corporate because if you look at your attrition numbers, could it be, question, that the demographic that's leading the turnover in your organization is Black women? Those two things are connected. So creating that culture of inclusion where women can show up, and even if they have an entrepreneurial aspiration, they can kind of not have to hide that. It impacts other areas of what they do. So with that in mind, and really helping leaders that are listening cultivate this sense of inclusion that's broader than I think some of the ways that we typically think about it, it includes having to dismantle some systemic barriers. Can you talk to us a little bit about ways that you've seen organizations do that successfully to really create authentic belonging for employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's such a great point that I don't think I made that connection between those stats about Black women being the fastest group of entrepreneurs, and also the fact that there's probably, when you look at turnover rates, it's probably, Black women. So thank you for making that connection. But I think as far as like barriers that I've seen, a lot of it to me has stemmed from a lack of education, right? Someone might engage in, I know some people don't like the term microaggression, but some people might engage in like an exclusionary behavior. And a lot of times it's because they just don't know. You're not in community with any Black people, right? So you might engage in, or you might say something, right? Where I don't mind, or I didn't mind when I was in academia. I was the only Black woman in my department. And, so every 2 months, I have a different hairstyle. I change my hair a lot. And so my colleagues would be really fascinated with these hairstyles, right? Because these are mostly men, white men in their high 50s and early 60s. And so I don't know, in their day, maybe some of these styles weren't things that they saw. So they're really fascinated with my hair. And so when they have questions, I don't really mind when they're like, oh, this is really interesting. They might say something like, how do you wash it? But like a lot of times they might say something, right, that I could consider to be a microaggression. And I recognize it's their ignorance and it's their lack of understanding and awareness. And so I think having opportunities for people to learn is really important, right? Where I was just part of an organization that did a discussion about Black women's experiences with hair discrimination. And I think that was a really powerful conversation where their Black women employees were able to open up and share, this is how hair bias affects me in the workplace. And this is how I've been affected outside of the workplace, right? So opening up conversations to have more nuanced discussions where you're talking about things like hair discrimination. I don't see that a lot. Yeah. I see things like inclusion for employees, but we don't understand that inclusion and equity can look and feel different for different people. So I think our conversations and our learning has to be more intentional and more nuanced, and look at like, what are the ways that people are being impacted by different systems, and what are the barriers that they experience, and how can we provide employees with actionable steps to address these sorts of things. So I think a lot of things stem from just a lack of education. And then also, I don't see a lot of accountability measures when I work with companies where, I might help them implement a training system, or I might help them create an employee resource group, right? Or I might do a workshop with their leaders. But I always tell them that if you don't have any accountability measures, you might sit here and the information goes into one ear and out the other. And then who's to say that in 3 months or 6 months, you're not reverting back to the behaviors that you essentially hired me to help you fix. So I think really making sure that if you want to address barriers, you have accountability measures in place. And that could be something as simple as having an anonymous feedback system that you've integrated where any employee can go into the system. It could be like a Google form. They can go in and they can say, hey, I had this experience with this manager and I would like it to be addressed, right? And if I know as a manager, there's this anonymous system so that if I engage in bad behavior, there's checks and balances in place, I'm going to be less likely to engage in that behavior. And so I don't see that all the time, especially I work with some smaller organizations too. I don't always see that with organizations and with startups. It's like, we want to grow as fast as possible, but it's important to put those systems in place so that inevitably when there is inequitable behavior, there's a way to sort of address it.